Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
We're continuing our series on concubinage in Islam. And Dr. Shabir, we've looked at how different scholars have said that concubinage is legal in Islam, in Islamic law. And now I want to take a moment, Dr. Shabir, for us to take a step back and think about what is the basis for which they made that decision. What are the building blocks that they used to come up with the idea that concubinage was legal?
Yeah, so basically, as with other subjects in Islamic law, they go to the Quran, they find verses there that deal with the subject, they go to the life example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, they see what he did or is reported to have done, and also what is reported to have said, or what was happening in his lifetime, and he acquiesced in it, meaning that he did not object to what was going on. So all of this become now precedent for Islamic law. But more than this, they also look at the practice of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and they would take that as some kind of tacitly approved lifestyle that is part of the Islamic ethos. And they wouldn't even stop there. They would go to even subsequent generations, the followers of the companions or the followers of the followers. And even so, maybe they'll go to scholars in the Middle Ages who were commentators on the Quran and explicators of the Hadith, the reported sayings, actions, and what the Prophet, peace be upon him, acquiesced in. So it's a whole conglomerate of sources, and sometimes they are not carefully stratified. So when someone says this is the Islamic law, we can't be sure where exactly they got it from. Is it a verse of the Quran? Is it something the Prophet, peace be upon him, said? Is it something that he tacitly approved? Or it is assumed that he approved, and so on. So it is necessary, I believe, for us, if we're going to revisit this or any other question in Islamic law, that we stratify the sources and we make sure that we know, if we're saying Islam says so, where does it actually come from? Is it the Quran? Is it the Prophet Muhammad? Is it one of the scholars of the Middle Ages? Who?
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting is that we do have the source material, right? We have the Quran and the Hadith available to us that we can actually parse through.
Yes. And in looking at the Quran is a fixed text of some 6,236 verses, or a different number of verses depending on how you truncate the verses to number them. Mm-hmm. But basically the same content. Within the two covers, you have basically the same content. Even with some variant readings, you have basically the same message brought out in all of these readings. So with the Quran, it's a simpler task. With the Hadith, we have a more gigantic task in front of us, in that, first of all, if something is reported that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, how do we know that he actually said it? Because the person who wrote this down, and in the books that we have them now, may have lived in the 3rd century of Islam, or a little bit before that. Maybe if we're lucky, we're dealing with a 2nd century individual like Imam Malik ibn Anas. But still, in the 2nd century, we're still dealing with the century after that of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And if you try to remember something that happened 100 years ago, well, you wouldn't remember and I wouldn't remember because we haven't lived that long, yes. Right? But we would get the information from informants. But even those informants may be trying to tell us about something that they witnessed or heard some 40 years prior to that. And if I try to remember something that actually happened 40 years ago, I may not remember the exact wording of what happened. Sometimes I can't even remember where I was on a certain date when a certain important event happened. So how do people remember all of these things? Well, you can only assume that after the Prophet, peace be upon him, passed away, there were people who were interested in his teachings to the extent that they went around, asked others, found out this information. They tried to categorize this information into various topics, and they memorized the particular snippets of report and so on, and then they passed that on from memory to the next generation, and then to the next generation until all of this information came to be written in the books as we have them now. Some of them may have had notes. Some German scholars like Gregor Scholler and others have posited that when Hadith narrators were teaching their students, They didn't just simply work from memory alone, but they would have had some notes, even in some rudimentary form, and based on the notes they're giving their lectures. But those notes are now lost to us, unless some of those were incorporated into the later writings. But we do not have any trace, anybody saying, okay, I'm just copying the notes of such and such a scholar. Everything in the written works that we have them now give the impression that these were verbally communicated orally from one generation to the other. Now, when we are dealing with this kind of oral transmission, in the case of the Quran, we don't have any doubt about the overall content, because all of the readings are basically giving us the same message. In the case of the Hadith, we have a lot of conflicting reports. It looks like some people remember things one way, some people remember things the other way. And a later scholarship tries to put them together by saying, okay, well, maybe they're both right. And let's imagine a scenario that would make them both right. But you would expect that the early generations who were transmitting this information would have known such a scenario. And when they are giving us only half of the information and leaving the other half for somebody else to narrate, they would have put them all together right from the very earliest generations. And then they would, put it all together and give us that amalgamation from the very start. But they didn't give us the amalgamation. And that obviously means that some knew one thing and some knew the contrary. And we have to sift through all of this information to know what is sound, what is not, and what really happened in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him.
Well, Dr. Shabir, we know that it wasn't just an intellectual exercise, right? People were actually practicing what the Prophet did and said. So, in that sense that people were practicing, do you think we have a greater sort of understanding of what actually happened because people were practicing as they went and linking it to the prophetic sayings?
To a certain extent, yes. But this is widely acknowledged already. And, there are many popular preachers out there, especially when it comes to the present topic at hand, who are basically working on the same assumption. So I hardly need to spell that out in great detail. But starting with that working assumption, let's look at the flip side of that and look at, what might challenge that basic assumption. For a long time, Orientalist scholars have been looking at the sources of Islam, and they're looking at how Islamic law has been formulated and what are the various trends and so on that operated in history. And they don't make assumptions. They just go with actual hard facts. They want to look at, if there is a saying of the Prophet reported, peace be upon him, they're not going to read more into it. If there's a verse of the Quran, they're not going to read more into it. They want to see what it actually says. Which is slightly different from the way in which Muslim scholarship has progressed. Muslim scholarship has actually progressed with a large number of assumptions that are built into things.
Well, I guess they take a connected approach to things, right?
Yes, something of that nature. But more than this, what the Orientalist scholars have pointed out is that there may be something mentioned in the Quran, and the Muslim scholars read more into it from their background, from their context, from their social milieu and whatever, and they imagine eventually all of that to be what the Quran is actually saying. Sometimes the Quran leaves something unmentioned, and later scholarship tries to fill in the blanks. This is what is known in Arabic as ta'yin al-mubham, specifying that which was obscure. So we have to distinguish between what the Quran actually says and what later scholarship said that it meant, because they could have made an assumption about something. When it comes to the Hadith narratives regarding what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said and did and acquiesced in, there could have been a lot of things pertaining to the culture and social milieu of the time. Just thinking that the Prophet, peace be upon him, witnessed something, but he didn't object to it, and that means it's okay. And that is an assumption about what's going on in the mind of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The most one can say is that he had the responsibility to correct something that he saw was going wrong. But maybe it's in God's wisdom directing his Prophet, peace be upon him, and guiding him to overlook certain things which would be wrong in a later age, such as ours, but at the time, there's not much you can do about it, and you have to pick your battles and leave this one alone. So are we dealing here with one of those things? For example, when we talk about concubinage, is it one of those things that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was guided by God to leave alone? And it is reported that he himself had a concubine. So we need to revisit those reports and see if there is even a contrary report to that, saying, for example, that he married the supposed concubine in question. So all of this needs to be revisited. We need to go back to our sources, look at the Quran first in a stratified approach without mixing it with anything else, letting something else overshadow what the Quran actually says. So look at the Quran pure and simple, and then look at the life example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to see if he really had a concubine and what did he really say about the practice, if anything, and then see where it came from. That it is so commonly accepted among Muslim scholars, some even to this day, that just by merely owning a woman as a slave girl, the man would have the automatic right to go to bed with her.
So, Dr. Shabir, you set the stage very well for a conversation about the sources of this ruling. So we'll do that in future segments. So thank you.
Sure. You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe. And please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.